Turn to 2 Kings chapter 3, where we are continuing our study of the life and times of Elijah and Elisha, although like I've mentioned last week or so, more kind of Elisha, not so much Elijah anymore at this point. We're moving to the next generation. We finished up last week, chapter 2, talking about a couple of the first recordings of miraculous things that Elisha performs. One is the spring of Jericho that he makes good water again from, and then the young men of the city of Bethel who he calls out some bears to attack because they called him baldhead. We found that to be the case, I believe, last week. So. And so we talked about that. We started chapter 3. We kind of talked about the setup of what's going on. I want to review it just a little bit before we continue on. Chapter 3, we have now King Joram over Israel. He was we believe, the younger brother of Ahaziah, both sons of Ahab. If you remember back to 2 Kings chapter 1, Ahaziah did not reign for very long. He fell and pretty much died soon after. We've talked about that story already and all the messed up things that he went through on that too. But Joram is not really any better. He is also considered a bad king in the eyes of the Lord. But it says he wasn't quite as bad as Ahab and Jezebel. So he was an evil king, but not as evil as them. So again, kind of proving to us that Ahab was really the worst, because it says of his sons they weren't quite as bad as Ahab was. So, that's the bar, I guess, is Ahab. Not as bad as them, but still was going after idolatry. He talks about the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. I was blanking on that word for a second. And so he's a bad king, not good. And we remember back to 2 Kings chapter 1 that the first thing it says is, at that time, Moab revolted. But it seems that Ahaziah had done nothing about that in his short reign, and so now it's Joram's problem, and he's going to have to deal with this rebellion of Moab. We get some description of what Moab had done as far as tribute with lambs and wool and such, but they've stopped doing that. They're in open rebellion against Israel. We referenced 2 Samuel chapter 8, where it talks about the nations that David had subjugated during his reign, and it seemed that Moab was still in that subjugation until after the death of Ahab. Once Ahab died, they decided, now's our chance to throw off the Israelite reign over us, and we're going to go ahead and have our own powers, and we're not going to pay tribute to them anymore. And basically Joram is going to have to deal with that. And that's kind of where we stopped, was the end of verse 5. And then we're going to get into the story here for the rest of the chapter in just a minute. Any comments, anything we need to cover before we dive further into chapter 3? I think I summed it up decently there. Okay. All right, then. Let's go ahead and get into chapter 3. I'm hoping we can finish it this week. So I'm going to read for us 2 Kings chapter 3, verses 6 through 9, please. 6 through 9. Okay, so anyone feeling a little bit of deja vu here? I feel like we've had this conversation before, and we're going to get into that. Just another note here. I think your translation said Jehoram. Jehoram, it's the same word. Some of your translations may give a different name, but we're talking about the same person here. Just variants of the same name. My translation uses Joram, so that's what I'm saying. But Jehoram, it's the same guy. We're not talking about two different people here. So we see King Joram here. He's mobilized for war against Moab. This is his response to Moab's rebellion. Is he's going to go in force and he's going to fight them over this. He's going to go to war about this. And as far as we know, this is his idea. I'm bringing this up now because this is going to come up later. This is what he decides to do. And additionally, he sends word to King Jehoshaphat of Judah asking if he would assist them against Moab, and King Jehoshaphat agrees to help. He says, my people are your people, my horses are your horses. This is basically the same exact answer that Jehoshaphat gave to Ahab back in 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 4, when Ahab asked Jehoshaphat, hey, would you go with me to fight the Arameans in Ramoth Gilead? And that's the exact same thing that Jehoshaphat said. Now, how did that battle turn out for them in 2 Kings chapter 22? Not so great. Not so great. So, they were defeated by the Arameans, and Ahab himself dies because of the battle and the wounds he sustains from it. But he gives this exact same answer. So we're given this question, I guess, looking at all the context and what's happened up to this point. Why is Jehoshaphat still willing to do this? Why is he going to do this again? Does anyone have any thought about why he would do this again? Okay.
Was stronger than whether or not he would win the battle.
And there's a little bit more detail to that. You're kind of hitting on it.
I don't read in the reading here.
Not here, but we know.
God about the matter.
Well, we know from other places that we've mentioned before in this study about maybe why they have this closeness. Bethany? Yeah, so hey, remember that? Ahab's daughter had married the son of Jehoshaphat, so they were entwined in an alliance. This is a formal, official alliance. It's not just that they, are, brethren, being all Israelites, descendants of Abraham. It is, they are in a formal alliance here because of this marriage. Now, Ahab is dead, but the king of Israel is the brother, I guess the brother-in-law of the future king. There's still that alliance bond there. It has not dissolved. I mean, you get to a certain, generational difference. Eventually that goes away. But it's strong enough here that I think what's happening is Jehoshaphat is still honoring this formal alliance, even though it's not Ahab, but it's Ahab's son. So it's still a very, very strong familial bond. And I think he is honoring this alliance. Now, you could say that this is Jehoshaphat doing a nice, honorable thing. He's honoring the alliance. He's not turning his back on his allies. But I think we can agree, and we'll probably talk about this more, and we talked about it before. Having Jehoshaphat's son marry the daughter of Ahab was a bad decision. It seems that his goal was to have peace between the two nations, Israel and Judah. They had times where they were fighting each other. His goal seems to have peace. That's the indication I get from pieces of 1 Kings chapter 22, is that he wanted peace between the two nations. This was his way of going about it. But we're kind of going to see here again that he's kind of put along for the ride here. This is not really to Jehoshaphat's benefit. This alliance is going to cause more problems later on, specifically concerning the daughter of Ahab, which we are going to get to in this study. So he's honoring this alliance, but this is not going to work out in the long term. This is not really something that is going to go well for them. But that seems to be what he's doing. This is why he seems to be willing to go through this whole, dance again, is he's honoring the alliance. So he's going to go with the Israelites. He's going to bring in his nation to fight against Moab. So we see that they choose the route to attack Moab is through the desert of Edom. Now, this means, and some of your translations will say this is a roundabout route to travel. They would have to go south all the way, kind of paralleling the Jordan River. Then they have to go around the southern end of the Dead Sea and then come back up to attack from the southern part, the southern border of Moab. It seems to be the indication here, is they're not going across the Jordan River, which would be the shortest route. They're going all the way down around the Dead Sea. So not maybe the best route as far as the terrain here, and we're going to talk about this more, but this is the route they choose. Now, we're not told exactly why this is the route they choose, but one detail we are told here is that the king of Edom is also joining them in this fight. This may be why they're going through Edom, is to pick up some allies along the way. But I need to kind of stop and talk about Edom for a second, because he's here, and we're like, well, okay, we didn't hear a conversation about this, but we kind of need to talk about this because there are going to be some people who say there's some contradictions here. Somebody messed up when they wrote the Bible. So we need to kind of stop and talk about Edom for just a second. Hopefully none of you mind. Sorry, this is going to take about a page of notes, but we need to talk about Edom's current status here. So Edom, for those of you who may not be aware, Edom was the nation descended from Esau, the brother of Jacob, also known as Israel. So there is, again, kind of a familial bond here, very distant, but there is one. Of course, the same for Ammon and Moab also. They're all sort of related in a way, all descendants of Terah, if you will. Anyway, so that's the Edomites. And we see Edom was one of the nations subjugated by King David in Israel, as was seen in 2 Samuel chapter 8, verses 12 through 14. There's a little bit more detail about Edom compared to Moab, because Moab is also one of those mentioned, but it talks about the garrisons that David had set up, and all. There's some more detail specifically for Edom. We also see details about that in 1 Chronicles chapter 18, verses 11 through 13, if you want to reference that also. Now, 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 14 through 22, also gives some additional information saying that Joab, which was the commander of David's armies, how he had gone in, he had wiped out all the men of Edom, save for a man of the royal lineage named Hadad, not Ben-Hadad, not the Aramean, Hadad of Edom. He fled to Egypt for a time, and seems he returned during the reign of Solomon. I'm not going to get into a whole deep dive on the kings and chiefs of Edom, because that's going to be a whole thing. And if you're going to look up Hadad, you're going to notice suddenly there's a lot of Hadads in the Edomite lineage. I'm just going to leave it there. I'm not going to dive into that. That's a whole nother deep dive subject. But no, the Edomites are still around. They were not completely wiped out, but they were very much subjugated up to this point. Now, in 1 Kings chapter 22, which we have read, verse 47 mentions that there was no king in Edom, and this is talking a section of verses about the reign of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. It said there was no king in Edom at the time. But during the reign of Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, not Jehoram, the king of Israel, different person, which, again, this gets confusing. But Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, Edom sets up its own king in 2 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 8, and rebels against Judah. And this would have been, of course, after these events in 2 Kings chapter 3, because this is the generation after Jehoshaphat's time. Of course, Jehoshaphat is in this story. Now, if you have been paying attention to what I've been saying here, it's going to sound like we have an issue as far as, wait, it said in 1 Kings chapter 22 there was no king in Edom, and we get to 2 Kings chapter 3 and there is a king in Edom, but after that it talks about they set up a king because they didn't have one. So who is this king here in 2 Kings chapter 3? Kind of becomes the question. There shouldn't be a king here if you're reading it like that, as we have, I'm not going to say chronologically because that's not right, as we have in the way it's been written. And some people are going to point to that and say, well, this is an inconsistency in the Bible. This is an error. We can't trust anything the Bible says now. I don't think that this is an error. I think it's an error in understanding when these events are taking place. If we go back to 1 Kings chapter 22, the section where it talks about Jehoshaphat's reign, it is a summation of his reign. It's not saying this thing happened exactly at this time. There are some things that probably, we get to the later part where it talks about his dealings with Ahaziah. That was probably toward the end of his reign. I think these things are talking about the king of Edom, I think is saying there was no king in Edom by the time his reign was over. I think there has been a king in Edom, and then we're going to get to after the events of 2 Kings chapter 3, and then there will not be a king in Edom. Then there will be one set up in Chronicles 21, or 2 Chronicles chapter 21, excuse me. during the reign of Jehoshaphat's son. This is not an error. This is an error in understanding. It's not an error in the text. Because, you just read it, you go to 1 Kings, oh, there's no king in Edom. You get to 2 Kings, oh, wait, there's a king now. And then you get to 2 Chronicles and it talks about some new king they've risen up. I think is how that should be read, or that is not the way it should be read. It should be read that by the time Jehoshaphat's reign had ended, as it's talking about in 1 Kings chapter 22, there is no more king after that. So there is a king here still, but maybe right after this battle or soon after, that king dies, has no heir, and the kingship is kind of gone for a time. And then what it talks about in 1 Kings chapter 22 is true. It's ruled by a governor, deputy, depending on your translation. And then there will be one set up after the reign of King Jehoshaphat. So I wanted to go through that just in case you ever hear that argument. I think that is a misunderstanding of the text, how it is written. So I did want to address that just for a second. Anyway, so did I make sense about that? Any questions about the king of Edom? I hope I made sense when I said that. I kind of jumped around as far as verses went. Go ahead.
Well, it's also further supported by right after in 1 Kings 22, in verse 50, it says Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers, which is Jehoshaphat died, and then later in 2 Kings we're talking about Jehoshaphat again.
Yeah.
So obviously, what's in 2 Kings 22 can't be chronologically related to what's in 2 Kings.
Yeah, and
Otherwise, he would have been dead and been raised from the dead.
yeah, that would have been something. I'm sure we would have heard about that. Yeah. So no, that's a good point too. Is that we could also say, this is a summation. It's not in chronological order because, yeah, he's still around here, obviously. Yeah, very good. That's a great point. Let me talk about the land of Edom for a second before we move on in the text. The land of Edom, it talks about the desert of Edom here in what we've read. Edom is a very desolate place. It's not, lush with vegetation. It's not that kind of land. It's arid. It's desert. Basically, they got a lot of their economy was based off of salt mining, things of that nature. It was not a place of harvesting lots of food and cattle and things like that. Now, it says they go through, so again, this place gets very little rainfall, I guess is my point here. And they're marching through 7 days, and they run out of water, which this is a bad thing. You don't want to run out of water while you're going through a desert. That may seem like, yeah, common sense, like you will die if you don't have enough water. But even if you get low on water, if you're starting to ration it, you're only getting so much water at so many points and only so much at a time. Even if you're able to keep your army alive, they're not going to fight very well. I think a great example of this in history is July the 4th, 1187, which 1187 is probably not a date that stands out to a lot of you. July the 4th maybe, but this has nothing to do with America. Way back in Crusader times, the Muslim forces of Saladin wiped out a massive Crusader army during the Battle of Hattin because the Crusader forces had been drawn away from sources of water and they ran out. And then so when the battle actually commenced in full, they did not have the strength to fight, and so they were just completely wiped out. Like it was more of a massacre than an actual battle at that point, even though numbers-wise it should have been, this should have been a great battle. It should have been close and contested, and it wasn't, just because they didn't have water. It's not like they had died. They hadn't gotten to the point where they were dying, but they had been rationing their water because they knew they were running low, and they got, basically heat exhaustion, if you will, or heat stroke. You can't fight very well when you've got that. So they're in a really bad situation here, is what I'm saying. They're running out of water, and they're in the middle of a desert, and they're about to go fight. Things are going bad here for them all of a sudden. So, and we're going to see how this kind of unfolds. Any comments, questions up through verse 9? I know I've kind of thrown a lot out there. Probably a lot of stuff you didn't even care to know, but, that's what I do here, I guess. Okay, go ahead, Jeff.
Jehoshaphat's attitude toward the house of Ahab. A lot of people sometimes, and I don't know that we don't know for sure all of his motivations for making this alliance. But there are some people from time to time that want to favor a person who is shows that he has the inclination and the propensity to do the work of a deacon. Maybe he's not in a position, doesn't have any authority, but just as an individual, he does a lot of things that deacons do, as far as in the church and things like that, volunteers himself in that way. That's a person that you might appoint, assuming he's qualified otherwise, to a position of a deacon, but don't put a person in that position of, well, maybe this will stir him to do better. But there's a lot of times when the church recognizes a person like that, a lot of times he does better, and that's great. But it is an unwise practice to do it in that manner, because when he doesn't, if he's like some people who view the position as, well, I've arrived, I've achieved my position, and now I can just enjoy the privileges, and he doesn't want to do the work, then you made a terrible mistake, and the church pays the price. So we always give people the benefit of the doubt, trust people, but they're especially on matters that are important, prove them. Let them prove themselves, as they should, in whatever way they should. Another thing I'm thinking about Edom, and I'm thinking about the fact that God blessed Esau's and Isaac's descendants, both the Ishmaelites too, but they were going to be subjected to the descendants of Jacob and the children of Israel. This was God's plan. And it calls to mind the fact that all of us have to accept whatever role God puts us in. We may be in a leadership role, we may not be. We may be in a dominant role, but we may not be. And are we willing to accept that and still serve the Lord? Because God did bless the Edomites. They had 12 princes, if I'm going by my memories of what God said would happen.
Yeah, the whole chiefs and princes, and it's kind of complicated a little bit.
What I'm saying is they were successful.
They had their own nation, solidly, yeah.
Nation, they were successful. There's that they call it a treasury. It looks like a temple carved into the rock. There's on one. It's been on several movies. It's pretty cool looking. It shows a very well developed culture. It looks pretty desolate area, but still a very well developed culture and a strong people. And so they were blessed, and we will be blessed too. But there are times that we must accept the fact that we are not the ones in the center of attention, and that's got to be fine. It's not about us, it's about serving the Lord. And if we have that fixed in our mind, we'll be fine. But all of us need to think about what our role is and how to best work for the Lord in whatever opportunities God presents us, and be happy with that, be content with that.
Yeah, the people of Edom did not really typically have good relationships with the Israelites most of the time. This is one of these rare instances where they're working together. This does not happen very often. And in my mind, they're probably working together because they're still under the thumb of the Israelites a little bit until we get to King Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat's reign, where they also will rebel later on too. So that's another story for another time. But we look at books like Obadiah, and we see that Edom was not really willing to serve the Lord in the way they should have. They were a very proud people. That's kind of the big thing that Obadiah really pulls out against the people of Edom is their pride. You think you're so great. You think you are untouchable. No one can pull you down. Guess what the Lord's going to do to you here in just a little while. Obadiah is not very kind to the people of Edom, and we can look through the history of their interactions with the Israelites, and it never really goes well. This is one of these few moments of cooperation, but this is a rare moment indeed, as far as scriptural history goes for us. Very good. Any other comments through verse 9? Okay, let's move on. Let's get someone to read for us verses 10 through 20. 10 through 20. Okay. So, citing here the lack of water, Joram, the king of Israel, seems to blame God here for calling them all together just to deliver them into the hands of the Moabites. Now, as far as we know from the text, God has not told them to do any of this up to this point. He hasn't been involved. He hasn't been mentioned. They haven't inquired of the Lord at all. The Lord hasn't sent anybody to him and saying, this is what you must do. I kind of get the impression this is Joram's idea, and now he's blaming God for the fallout. When you're a politician, you got to know who to point the finger at. That's the first thing you learn is you got to point the finger at someone else. No, it's God's fault. It's not my fault. I would have never caused this to happen. This has got to be God's doing here. I bring this up because this is going to get said again. But guess who's with him? Jehoshaphat, for whatever faults we keep mentioning about him, he's a good king. And he says, hey, why don't we consult the Lord? Is there not a prophet here we can talk to? Guess what? This is the same thing he did back in 1 Kings chapter 22 when Ahab had all these prophets, parade before them, and 450 or whatever. And they say, oh, yeah, go up to Ramoth Gilead. It'll be great. You'll have victory. And Jehoshaphat's like, can we talk to a prophet of God, please? Not these guys. I don't know them. So Jehoshaphat's coming through again in a pinch. Really being outstanding here. Jehoshaphat's all right. So apparently there is one of the men of Israel says, oh yeah, there's Elisha's here. He's the one that served Elijah back in the day. He's here. Which leads us to another question is, well, first of all, Jehoshaphat says that's good. Let's all go down to him. That'll be great. But why is Elisha here? I don't know if you wondered that, but if you go back to the previous chapter where we ended in chapter 2, Elisha had, he'd gone to the east side of the Jordan River with Elijah. Elijah went up into heaven. He crosses back over to the west side. He's in Jericho. After he fixes the spring in Jericho, he goes up from there to Bethel, to Israel, where we have the bear incident. And then he goes up to Mount Carmel, and then he comes back down to Samaria. And that's where he is when that chapter ends. So he's all the way up in Israel, in the capital. And then here in chapter 3, he just happens to be in the desert of Edom for some reason. Now, we can kind of narrow this down to probably two possibilities. Either God told him to go out there ahead of time knowing that this is what was going to happen, and he wanted Elisha on hand for when this moment occurred. Or perhaps Elisha has been following the army of Israel this entire time, and now they've just taken stock and said, well, maybe we should consult this guy who's been following us around. It's not really clear why he's there, how he got there. It's not improbable, though. I'm not going to say this is some impossibility, because first of all, we don't know. We know it's already been 7 days for them to march around to this point. And it could be that Elisha was either already there or he was going with them at that point. So this is not some sort of improbable, this is not a mistake of the Bible, where people are saying, no, he should be in Samaria, he shouldn't be here. He could have come here, he could have traveled there. It's not an impossibility. It's just very interesting that God has provided a prophet to be there at the perfect moment. But probably more for the sake of Jehoshaphat than anything else. Go ahead.
I think we could all agree that God makes himself available to us.
Yeah.
He knows our needs, he understands, watches over us, understands what our circumstances are, and he will make himself available to us so that we could never say, hey God, I called upon you, but you weren't there. And this was God's method for the Israelites to call upon him.
Yeah.
Prophet. So he makes his prophet available to them, and that certainly makes sense. And certainly for us, we can just pray to God. We don't have to go through anyone specifically. But even in that day, I think, in my mind, and probably, I'll put it that way, directed Elisha to that area, giving them a chance if they wanted to call on him. And he made it known that he was down there so that the word could get to the king.
Yeah, they knew he was there. He wasn't hiding or anything. So let's actually get into the conversation, because that'll probably back up a lot of what you're saying here is they go down to him, and Elisha seems a little bit offended that King Joram of Israel is coming to seek his advice. He says, go to the prophets of your father and mother. if your idols are so great, why are you not talking to them? Of course, his response is, well, it was God who sent us out here, and now this is his fault. He seems to kind of be blaming God again for this. Again, we don't see any indication that this is God who has told them to do this. This seems to be Joram's idea. But, he's pointing the finger pretty well. And go ahead.
That is a good question. Why didn't he? It seems to me that this might be a window into Joram, that he's not a very religious person. He's a political person, and he uses religion in a political fashion.
Sure. Just like the way that Jeroboam did. Yeah.
There's a lot of people who worship, the occult is making a comeback in our current, especially among younger generations right now. It's and the mystical and things like that. But a lot of people see them as methods of power, means of cultural power,
Or influence, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
What can it do for me? And so, it seems to me that Joram was not a sincere, religious, devoted person.
Yeah, he seems to be going to Elisha just because Jehoshaphat requested it, and he's going along with it.
Seems to me polls show that most people like Baal, so I'll like Baal now.
Yeah. No, I could agree with that idea. But I mean, so Elisha's response is basically I wouldn't even be talking to you if it wasn't for Jehoshaphat being here. So again, Jehoshaphat is really saving the day here, not just the fact that he's suggesting, hey, maybe we should seek a prophet of God and, actually being there so that the prophet of God will talk to them. Because Elisha is making it clear that God is not pleased with Joram. I mean, we kind of read about that already early in this chapter, that he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. But he's been in an idolatry. As Jeff said, why isn't he going to the other prophets? If they're so great, why aren't you consulting them? It may be that Joram is perfectly understanding that those prophets that they have really don't do anything. They're there for the show, basically. So, but because Jehoshaphat's there, Elisha's going to talk to them. And he asks, I believe the translation that was read said musician. My translation says harpist. Does anyone have something different than that? It's in verse 15. He asks for a musician, a harpist. Any other translations on that? Minstrel. Okay. All right. Now, you may ask, okay, they're in the middle of the desert of Edom. Why is there going to be some random musician here? And I think we can put this one aside pretty quickly. They were probably brought with one of the kings. When they're sitting in their tent waiting for battle to happen, they're going to want some entertainment. They didn't have, their phones that they could just flip through. They didn't have Netflix. So you bring a musician along so that you're not bored in your tent for too long. That's something the kings would have access to. I don't think this is some miraculous thing. This musician just happens to be there. I think we could pretty clearly think, he was probably one of the king's musicians they brought along. So it was a common thing that was done, way up until, even modern days, they're going to have some sort of entertainment with them. It's just usually it's not in your pocket. So they have a musician there. This is not some crazy thing that's happened yet. But while the musician's playing, Elisha begins to prophesy and tell what's going to happen. So he says, this is what the Lord says. You dig these ditches. God's going to fill them up with water, and you're not going to see any wind or rain. They're going to fill up. This is going to be sort of a miraculous sign. It's not, because even deserts will get heavy rains from time to time, even though they don't get them very often. They do get them. It's not going to be it just so happens a rainfall comes. Now, this is miraculous. This is going to fill up with water. Once you dig these little trenches, God's going to fill them up. And some people would say, well, maybe they're just digging so deep they hit groundwater. I don't think that matches the description of what we see. That's kind of a little different. So, dig these trenches. There's going to be water put in them. No wind or rain is going to appear, but they're going to be filled up. And it's going to be enough for everyone in the army, including the animals they have with them. And furthermore, the Lord is going to deliver the Moabites into their hands. They're going to be victorious. And not only are they going to be victorious, but they're going to overthrow and destroy, their fortified major cities. They're going to cut down all the good trees. They're going to stop it with springs. They're going to ruin all the good fields. This is more than just, I'm going to win a battle. It's I'm going to destroy the land so that they won't be able to rebuild and come back and fight again for another day kind of thing. This is going to be sort of a total destruction kind of warfare. And then we see in the next morning, just as was prophesied, the land is filled with water. It's there. Again, no wind or rain, no storm to speak of. It's just, there's just now water here. And this would, we're in a desert, an arid land. It's not like, some spring, that was nearby happened to fill it up. That's not what's happening. Is water just appeared. This is a miraculous thing. This is not a natural occurrence. Sometimes we try to explain how these would happen naturally. Again, I don't think this is them digging so deep to hit groundwater, because groundwater doesn't work that way as described. So God has basically saved them, and then he's going to deliver the Moabites into their hands, as we'll see in the next final portion. Any comments or questions up to here, Jeff?
The water came by way of Edom, or at least my translation.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Or came from Edom, yeah.
it's often that it's still God, the work of God, and it is still most likely, almost surely, a miracle of some kind. It's the work of God, what we would call a miracle. But God often used natural processes to, when they crossed the Jordan into the land, he stopped up the water. There was an east wind that was used when the Red Sea was parted. God often used, I guess you would say, natural processes, natural forces to do things like this. We don't know the origin of this water exactly, but I agree with you, it's the hand of God.
Yeah.
I do want to mention about musician, and I'm not sure exactly. I probably could be a lot more to what I'm going to say that would be more in detail. Moses had a staff, and God would tell him to use that staff to, turn the, make a snake on the ground, or to hold it up for the Red Sea to part, and for the battles.
For various things, yeah.
Here, a musician is used, and when the music is played, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon the prophet. I think perhaps God uses things like that to help people focus and to trust in Him. The staff became a representation of the fact that Moses was God's representative. Now, perhaps if this is a way that was often done, this is a way that people would recognize that the prophet is God's prophet. And, we sing. Singing is another way of teaching. So you teach one another in psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, speaking, and so. But you wouldn't have to have the music, but it does help. It does some things to help. I think there's a parallel there in a sense.
And it could be that, also this is sort of a way for them to show their faith, that they're following the instructions. Even though, again, he probably doesn't need the musician. That's not really the point here. God doesn't need the power of some random court's minstrel to help him here. This is something that he's asked for them to do to show that they will follow instructions. That's the way I look at it. That may be me reading too much into it, but we see things like that in other places where, people are upset because God asked them to do something a certain way. And it's like, well, if you just done it, it would have been fine, but you didn't have faith, you didn't follow the instructions that God gave you, therefore nothing good is going to happen to you, or things like such as that. Well, we might hit one of those a little bit later here in this study, but it's not that God needs the musician in order for this to happen. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Any other comments? I want to finish out this chapter. Someone read for us verses 21 through 27, and we'll finish this out quickly here.
And when all the Moabites heard that the kings had come up to fight against them, all who were able to bear arms and older were gathered, and they stood at the border. Then they rose up early in the morning, and the sun was shining on the water. And the Moabites saw the water on the other side as red as blood. And they said, "This is blood. The kings have surely struck swords and have killed one another. Now therefore, Moab, to the
Okay. I'm hoping I can finish this part. So the Moabites, they're rallying now. They've heard that these three kings are coming to attack them, and they get everyone they can who is physically able to bear arms to fight. And I get from the way the text is written that some of these men may have been considered usually a little too young or maybe a bit too old to typically bear arms. I think they're sort of in desperation mode here. They've got Israel, Judah, and Edom they have to all fight. And so they're getting anybody they can to fight back. I think they think that they're outmatched here. So they're rallying everyone that they can to be part of this fight. So when the Moabites get there, they see the water, but they see it, and it looks to them like blood. Now, I'm not exactly sure if this is a trick of the eye or this is something that God was directly involved in. There's no way for us to really know for sure. But they think it's blood. They think that, these three kings, maybe they got in some disagreement last night about whose minstrel was better, and so they went and they killed each other, and, we'll just go, we'll get the spoils, and we're going to have ourselves a good old day. So they enter the Israelite camp, and of course that's not what's happened, and they're probably not ready for a fight, thinking that the fight's already over here, and they get wiped out by the Israelites. And it talks about, as was prophesied by Elisha, they destroy all these springs, fields, trees, all of that stuff are all destroyed. Talks about how they took down basically all of the cities. Only the Moabite city of Kir Hareseth was remaining intact. We have in verse 26 that the king of Moab, Mesha is his name. We saw that earlier in the chapter. He tries to get to the king of Edom with 700 swordmen, but he fails to reach him. Now, why he's trying to do that, we're not really told why. Is he trying to reach him to knock out the weakest link and maybe the rest of them will fall away? Or maybe if he can get to Edom, the king of Edom, maybe he can convince him to switch sides. I'm not really sure what the strategy here, but whatever he's trying to do, it fails. He's never able to get there. And then he gets really desperate in verse 27. It says, the king of Moab offered his eldest son as a sacrifice on the city wall. Presumably, this sacrifice would have been to the Moabite god of Chemosh. Chemosh is kind of the Moabite version of the Ammonite god of Molech, which child sacrifice was a thing for that deity. Chemosh was also associated with victory. So, he's really desperate here. He needs a victory. He's going to offer his son, the one who would be king after him as a sacrifice. It doesn't seem to note to us that this helps them win, but the Israelites, the people of Judah and of Edom, they see the indignation of the Moabites, and they say, this is done, we're done here. They've basically destroyed everything except for this one city, and they all go back to their land. So the Moabite rebellion is done. They've been pretty much wiped out down to this little one city. They're not going to be able to come back and fight against Israel or Edom or Judah. Pretty much from here on out, they're just going to be licking their wounds for generations because they have to rebuild all their fields, regrow all their trees. All their springs need to be redug because their land has just been totally destroyed. Their nation is not going to be a threat to anybody anymore at this point. So that's the end of chapter 3. Any comments, questions? We are out of time, so we're going to stop there for today. Okay. Next week, we'll move on to chapter 4. So if you want to read ahead, kind of know where we're going. Chapter 4 is a bit long, and there's actually a few stories here in chapter 4. We'll probably spend at least 2-3 weeks in chapter 4. So.